Once upon a time, there was a family who had just moved into a new house. They were thrilled to finally have a place of their own after years of renting, and the house seemed perfect in every way. However, it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. At first, it was just small things, objects moving on their own, doors closing by themselves, and strange noises in the night. The family tried to brush it off as their imagination, but things only got worse from there. One day, the mother was cleaning the basement when she heard a whisper. She turned around, but there was no one there. She went back to cleaning, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on her neck and turned around to see a ghostly figure hovering in the air. She screamed and ran up the stairs, never venturing into the basement again. Meanwhile, the daughter had started to notice strange markings on the walls of her bedroom. At first, she thought they were just scuffs or scratches, but they soon began to form words and messages. The messages were always dark and ominous, warning her of danger and telling her to leave the house immediately. She tried to tell her parents, but they didn't believe her. As time went on, the family became increasingly isolated and frightened. They didn't want to leave the house for fear of what they might find when they returned, and they began to argue and fight over every little thing. The strange occurrences continued, with doors slamming shut on their own and strange voices calling out in the night. Finally, the family could take it no longer. They packed their bags and left the house, never looking back. They later learned that the house had a dark history. It had been the site of a gruesome murder many years ago, and the spirit of the victim still haunted the house to this day. The family had been lucky to escape with their lives, but they would never forget the terror they had experienced in that house. As the family left the house, they felt a sense of relief and freedom they hadn't experienced since moving in. The weight of the strange occurrences they had experienced had been lifted, but the memory of them lingered in their minds. They decided to investigate the history of the house and its previous occupants. They discovered that a young woman had been murdered in the basement of the house many years before. Her killer was never found, and her spirit was said to still haunt the house. The family began to wonder if the warnings they had received from the ghostly messages and whispers were the young woman's way of trying to protect them. They felt grateful to have made it out of the house alive. The daughter, who had been particularly affected by the haunting, continued to have nightmares and waking hallucinations long after they had left the house. She sought therapy to deal with the trauma and eventually found some peace. The family couldn't help but feel that the house had a hold on them, even though they were no longer living there. They had nightmares and strange occurrences for months afterward, and they found themselves avoiding the street where the house was located. Eventually, the family moved on, but they would never forget the true creepy horror they had experienced in their new house. They learned that not everything is as it seems, and that some places carry the weight of the past long after the events have passed. As for the house, it remained vacant for many years after the family had left. It became a local legend, and people would often dare each other to spend the night there. Some claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of the young woman or heard her whispers in the night. In the end, the house was torn down and a new one was built in its place. But the memory of the true creepy horror story of the old house lived on, a reminder that some things are better left in the past. It was a dark and stormy night when the Johnson family arrived at their new house. They had just moved in, excited to start their new life in a quiet suburban town. The house was old, but it had been recently renovated, and they were thrilled to be the first ones to live in it. As they unpacked their belongings, strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, and objects would move around the room without anyone touching them. They tried to dismiss it as just their imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left them. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, they heard a loud banging coming from the attic. They cautiously climbed the stairs to investigate, but when they got to the top, they found nothing. But they could feel the chill in the air and hear the sound of footsteps coming from above them. The next day, they decided to ask their neighbors about the history of the house. What they heard made their blood run cold. The house was built on the site of an old asylum, and it was said that the ghosts of the patients still haunted the area. The Johnsons didn't know what to do, but they knew they couldn't stay in that house any longer. They tried to sell it, but no one was interested in buying. They decided to contact a paranormal investigator to help them get to the bottom of what was happening in their new home. The investigator found evidence of a malevolent presence in the house, and the family was advised to leave immediately. The Johnsons packed their bags and left, never looking back. Years later, the house still stands, but it remains abandoned. No one dares to enter it, and the legend of the haunted asylum continues to live on. The Johnson family had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. They were a practical family, who had always thought that everything had a rational explanation. But as they settled into their new home, they soon realized that there was something strange and eerie about it. It started with small things, like doors creaking and objects moving on their own. They dismissed it as just their imagination or the house settling. But as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. They would wake up to find their furniture moved around, or doors that they had locked before going to bed were now wide open. One night, when they were all gathered in the living room, they heard a loud banging coming from the attic. They looked at each other with fear in their eyes, but decided to investigate. As they climbed the stairs, the banging grew louder and more persistent. When they got to the top, they found nothing out of the ordinary. But they could feel the chill in the air and hear the sound of footsteps coming from above them. The next day, they decided to ask their neighbors about the history of the house. What they heard made their blood run cold. The house was built on the site of an old asylum, and it was said that the ghosts of the patients still haunted the area. The Johnsons couldn't believe what they were hearing, but it explained everything that had been happening in the house. They tried to ignore the supernatural occurrences, but it was becoming more and more difficult. They would wake up in the middle of the night to find themselves surrounded by an icy mist. They could hear whispers and moans coming from the walls. It was as if the spirits of the patients were trying to communicate with them. The Johnsons didn't know what to do, but they knew they couldn't stay in that house any longer. They tried to sell it, but no one was interested in buying. They decided to contact a paranormal investigator to help them get to the bottom of what was happening in their new home. The investigator found evidence of a malevolent presence in the house, and the family was advised to leave immediately. The Johnsons packed their bags and left, never looking back. Years later, the house still stands, but it remains abandoned. No one dares to enter it, and the legend of the haunted asylum continues to live on. The Johnsons never forgot their experience in that house and still shudder at the thought of what could have happened if they had stayed any longer. The new house on Elm Street had been on the market for months before the Browns finally decided to purchase it. It was a beautiful, sprawling Victorian with high ceilings, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that seemed to go on forever. They fell in love with it immediately, but little did they know that their dream home would soon become a nightmare. The first strange occurrence happened on their very first night in the house. They were awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, they thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer to their bedroom door. When they opened the door, there was no one there. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights would flicker on and off, and objects would move by themselves. The Browns tried to convince themselves that it was just their imaginations, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched. One day, while exploring the basement, they found a small room that had been sealed shut. When they broke the lock and opened the door, they were horrified to find an old-fashioned operating table, medical tools, and jars filled with unknown substances. It was clear that the room had once been used for some sort of medical experimentation, and the thought of what might have happened there made their skin crawl. As time passed, the Browns began to experience more and more terrifying occurrences. They would wake up in the middle of the night to find shadowy figures standing at the foot of their bed, and strange whispers could be heard in the walls. It seemed as if the house itself was alive, and it was intent on driving them mad. Finally, the Browns couldn't take it anymore. They packed up their things and left the house, never to return. It wasn't until years later, when a new family moved in, that they discovered the true horror of what had happened in their old home. The previous owners, a doctor and his wife, had used the house for illegal medical experiments, and it was rumored that they had even performed unspeakable acts on their own children. It was said that the spirits of the victims still haunted the house, and that they would never be at peace. The new family tried to ignore the rumors, but they soon discovered that they were all too true. The house was a living nightmare, and they too were forced to flee in terror. The old house on Elm Street remains vacant to this day, a testament to the horrors that can lurk within even the most beautiful of homes. Once upon a time, there was a young couple who had just purchased their dream home. It was a beautiful old house with a lot of character, nestled in a small town surrounded by woods. They were excited to start their new life in the house, but little did they know, their dream home would soon turn into a nightmare. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful, but then strange things started happening. The couple would hear strange noises in the middle of the night, and their belongings would move from their original spots. They brushed it off as the house settling or their imagination, but things got worse. One night, the couple woke up to the sound of a baby crying. They searched the house but couldn't find the source of the noise. They soon discovered that the house was built on an old graveyard, and the crying was believed to be the spirit of a baby buried there. The couple tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but things only got worse. They would wake up to find strange writing on their walls, doors opening and closing on their own, and shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms. The couple eventually decided to call in a paranormal investigator, who confirmed their worst fears. The house was haunted by several spirits, including the restless spirit of a woman who had died in the house decades earlier. The couple was terrified, but they couldn't afford to move out of the house. They tried to live with the spirits, but they soon realized that the spirits were becoming more aggressive. They would wake up with scratches and bruises, and the temperature in the house would drop to bone-chilling levels. The couple knew they had to do something, so they contacted a local priest to perform an exorcism on the house. The exorcism was a success, and the spirits were banished from the house. The couple was relieved, but they never forgot the horror they experienced in their dream home. They eventually moved out of the house, but they never truly escaped the memories of the true creepy new house horror stories that haunted them for the rest of their lives.